Anne St. Marie became fashion's most perfect ghost. But the woman who created that ghost was never allowed to exist. New York City, 1963. Richard Avedon stares at the contact sheets spread across his studio floor. Anne St. Marie's final proofs. Her beauty is flawless, every angle sculpted by light, every expression calibrated to perfection. But her eyes are already gone. The studio falls silent except for the hum of developing chemicals and the distant rumble of Manhattan traffic. Avedon's assistants have retreated to the darkroom, leaving him alone with these last images of the woman who had been his greatest muse. He picks up his loupe, studying each frame with the intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays, searching for signs of life in pictures that feel more like death certificates. "The camera took from me more than it ever gave," she had whispered to him just hours before, her voice barely audible above the clicking of shutters. The words had seemed like melodrama then. Anne had always possessed a theatrical streak that Avedon found both compelling and occasionally exhausting. But now, studying these last images, he finally sees what he had been too consumed with creating to notice: the gradual disappearance of the woman behind the muse. In frame after frame, Anne's technical perfection remains absolute. The positioning is flawless, the expressions precisely controlled, the way light catches her features still capable of stopping time itself. But something essential has vanished. The spark that had made their collaboration magical for over a decade, that ineffable quality that transformed mere fashion photography into high art, is simply gone. The decision comes not as drama, but as dissolution. One day, Anne St. Marie is the undisputed queen of haute couture, her face gracing magazine covers from New York to Paris to Milan. The next, she simply vanishes, leaving behind only haunting photographs that would define an era and a fashion industry suddenly orphaned of its most perfect reflection. Diana Vreeland receives the news at her Vogue office, surrounded by the controlled chaos of an upcoming issue. Her secretary delivers the message with characteristic discretion, but Vreeland's reaction is immediate and visceral. Her hands tremble, an almost imperceptible gesture that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know her intimately. As she removes Anne's images from the upcoming editorial calendar, "Fashion is not forever, it is only a moment," Anne had once told her during a particularly intense shoot for the September issue. But that moment can consume a life. At the time, Vreeland had interpreted the comment as artistic philosophizing. Now she understands it was a confession. The ripple effect spread through the fashion world with the speed of wildfire. Editors scrambled to replace covers that had been built around Anne's distinctive presence. Photographers who had scheduled sessions find themselves forced to reimagine concepts that had been designed specifically for her unique ability to embody haute couture. Designers who had come to depend on her to showcase their most important pieces suddenly find themselves without their most reliable interpreter. How does someone at the absolute pinnacle become a ghost haunting her own reflection? The industry scrambles for answers, creating explanations that range from exhaustion to marriage troubles to artistic differences. But perhaps the real question is simpler and more terrifying. What happens when you spend so long becoming someone else's perfect dream that you forget who you were meant to be? She vanished, but her image remained. And in that vanishing, Anne St. Marie revealed the cruelest secret of beauty itself: that sometimes the most exquisite creations require the complete erasure of their creators. But to understand how fashion's most enigmatic ghost learned to disappear so completely, we must return to a small Connecticut town where a girl named Marianne LeBlanc first discovered that stillness could be survival. Born in 1926 to working-class parents who understood struggle better than beauty, Marianne LeBlanc entered a world where women's identities were borrowed rather than built. Her father, Robert, worked with his hands, machinery and oil, and the practical weight of providing for a family during an era when economic security was never guaranteed. His fingers were perpetually stained, his back permanently bent from years of hunching over equipment. But his dedication to his family was absolute. Her mother, Catherine, had once dreamed of teaching, an ambition that seemed both modest and impossibly grand for a woman of her background and era. She had completed 2 years of normal school before family financial crisis forced her to abandon her studies and take work in a local textile mill. The sacrifice had been presented as temporary, but temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you were a working-class woman in Depression-era New England. Catherine's unfulfilled intellectual ambitions found their outlet in her fierce dedication to her daughter's education and cultural development. She insisted that Mary Ann take piano lessons despite the family's limited budget, checked out library books on art and literature to read aloud in the evenings, and maintained standards of speech and deportment that reflected aspirations rather than circumstances. Even as a child, Anne possessed an unsettling quality, a kind of perfect stillness that made people want to stare longer than was polite. She seemed to exist slightly outside normal time, as if perpetually posing for a photograph only she could see. During family gatherings, relatives would often comment on her unusual composure, the way she could sit motionless for hours while other children fidgeted and played. She was like a little statue, her elementary teacher would later recall. Beautiful, but so still it almost frightened you. The other children would be running around the playground, but Mary Ann would just stand there, perfectly composed, watching everything like she was memorizing it. What they didn't understand was that Anne had discovered stillness as protection. In a household where emotions ran high and money was perpetually tight, she learned that drawing attention to herself often meant becoming the focus of anxieties that were too large for a child to understand or address. When she remained motionless, she became invisible in all the ways that mattered. Present enough to avoid concern, absent enough to avoid becoming a target for stress or frustration. She learned to be a ghost to survive, a skill that would later make her fortune and cost her everything. The transformation of this survival mechanism into artistic asset began gradually during her teenage years. High school brought new challenges as Anne's striking appearance attracted attention that she hadn't sought and wasn't entirely comfortable receiving. Boys began to notice her in ways that felt both thrilling and threatening, while girls oscillated between friendship and jealousy in patterns that she found difficult to navigate. Her teachers, recognizing her academic abilities alongside her unusual poise, began to suggest possibilities that seemed fantastical to her parents. College scholarships were discussed, though the family's financial situation made even the reduced costs associated with such opportunities seem overwhelming. The guidance counselor mentioned secretarial school as a more practical alternative, respectable work that would provide security without requiring the kind of investment that could bankrupt a working-class family. But fate intervened in the form of a traveling photographer who visited the high school to document the student body for a local newspaper feature. Harold Morrison had spent 30 years capturing weddings, graduations, and civic events throughout central Connecticut. But when he spotted Anne standing in the hallway between classes, something made him pause. "Young lady," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to directing subjects. "Would you mind standing over there by the window? I'd like to take a photograph for the newspaper." The session lasted only 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes changed everything. Morrison positioned Anne near a tall window where natural light created dramatic shadows across her face, and for the first time in her life she experienced the strange alchemy that occurred when camera met subject. The awkward teenager with the shy smile was transformed into someone elegant and mysterious, someone who seemed to possess secrets worth discovering. When the photograph appeared in the local paper the following week, the response was immediate and surprising. Morrison received calls from several local businesses asking about the young lady in the school photograph, wondering if she might be available for commercial work. The concept of professional modeling was foreign to the LeBlanc family, but the offer of $5 per session, more than Catherine earned for a full day at the textile mill, made it impossible to ignore. The camera found her first through a local photographer's visit to her high school. $5 per session to model junior clothes for a Hartford department store. The money was modest, but the transformation was profound. Through the lens, awkward Marianne became someone elegant, mysterious, untouchable. Those early sessions in Hartford opened a world that the LeBlanc family had never imagined. The department store's photography studio was modest by professional standards, but to Anne it felt like entering a magical realm where ordinary reality was suspended and beauty could be manufactured through careful arrangement of lights, fabrics, and poses. The photographer James Wheeler had worked in New York before returning to Connecticut to establish his own commercial practice. He recognized immediately that Anne possessed qualities that transcended local department store work. A natural understanding of how to move in front of cameras, an ability to embody the essence of clothing rather than simply wearing it, and most importantly, a capacity to project whatever emotion or attitude the photograph required. "I wasn't playing a part, the dress was," she would later explain to Avedon, trying to articulate the strange alchemy that occurred when she stepped before cameras. But even then, she was learning the dangerous art of disappearing into other people's visions. Wheeler began using Anne for increasingly sophisticated assignments, transitioning from simple catalog work to editorial spreads for regional fashion magazines. Each session required her to become someone different: the sophisticated city girl, the wholesome farm daughter, the rebellious teenager, the elegant young woman. The variety was intoxicating, offering Anne escape from the limitations of her actual circumstances while providing income that significantly improved her family's financial situation. But the work also began to create a troubling disconnect between Anne's public and private selves. The girl who emerged from photography sessions, confident, elegant, seemingly sophisticated beyond her years, felt like a stranger to the quiet teenager who returned home to help with household chores and homework. The contrast was so dramatic that Anne began to feel like she was living two separate lives that had no connection to each other. The progression from Connecticut to New York happened like film developing in chemicals, slowly, then all at once. By 1946, Marianne LeBlanc had died and Anne St. Marie was born, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the hard-won knowledge that survival meant becoming whatever others needed you to be. The decision to adopt a new name was both practical and symbolic. Marianne LeBlanc sounded provincial, too obviously connected to the small-town background that would be a liability in the sophisticated world of New York fashion. Anne St. Marie suggested European elegance, a cosmopolitan background that could encompass any number of exotic possibilities. But the name change also represented something deeper, a conscious decision to shed her past identity entirely and create herself anew. The girl who had learned to survive by becoming invisible had discovered that the ultimate invisibility came through transformation into someone else entirely. New York in 1946 was a city rebuilding itself after the war, full of energy and optimism, but also remarkably harsh toward young women who arrived with more ambition than resources. Anne's early months were marked by the same combination of glamour and desperation that characterized most aspiring models' experiences. Tiny apartments shared with other hopefuls, survival on coffee and crackers, endless rounds to photographers' studios and modeling agencies where rejection was far more common than acceptance. The competition was fierce and often cruel. Established models guarded their relationships with photographers and editors jealously, while newcomers were forced to prove themselves repeatedly in an industry that valued youth and novelty, but also demanded experience and professional polish. Anne discovered that her small-town background, which she had tried so hard to disguise, actually provided advantages that many of her more sophisticated competitors lacked. a work ethic forged by necessity, resilience developed through genuine hardship, and an appreciation for opportunities that others took for granted. Eileen Ford spotted her first during an open call at her newly established modeling agency. Ford had built her reputation by recognizing potential that others missed, and she saw immediately that Anne possessed something special. Not just physical beauty, but an indefinable quality that could transform clothing into art. "She has the face of haute couture," Ford told her associates after Anne's audition. "She doesn't just wear clothes, she becomes them." It was the highest compliment the legendary agent could give, though neither woman understood it was also a curse. The partnership with Ford Models provided Anne with access to opportunities that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Ford's connections throughout the fashion industry meant steady work with reputable photographers, appearances in major magazines, and exposure to the kind of haute couture that represented fashion's highest aspirations. But success in Ford's stable also meant conforming to standards that were even more demanding than anything Anne had previously experienced. Every aspect of her appearance was scrutinized and managed, her weight monitored to the ounce, her skin treated with regimens that were both expensive and time-consuming. Her wardrobe carefully selected to reinforce the image that Ford was selling to clients. The breakthrough came when Avedon selected her for Harper's Bazaar, shooting Dior's latest collection. The collaboration created images that would define fashion photography for decades, but it also revealed Anne's most dangerous gift, her ability to embody perfection by erasing herself completely. The first session with Avedon was unlike anything Anne had experienced during her career to that point. Where other photographers had treated her as a beautiful object to be positioned and lit appropriately, Avedon approached her as a collaborator in creating something that transcended traditional fashion photography. The studio was a theater where clothing became costume, poses became performance, and photography became a form of storytelling that required psychological as well as physical transformation. Avedon's demands were intense and specific. He wanted not just beauty but emotion, not just elegance but narrative, not just fashion but art. "Every photograph is a coffin for the moment, and I'm always inside it," she wrote in her diary after that first session. The metaphor was more accurate than poetry. Each image captured her while simultaneously burying the woman who created it. The collaboration with Avedon established Anne as one of the most sought-after models in New York. But it also initiated a process of psychological transformation that would prove increasingly difficult to control. Avedon's vision of Anne was so compelling and complete that it began to replace her own sense of self, creating a feedback loop where she existed primarily to fulfill his artistic requirements. The relationship was professional but intensely personal, built on an understanding that transcended normal photographer-model dynamics. Avedon saw in Anne the perfect embodiment of his aesthetic vision, while Anne found in his work a form of artistic expression that gave meaning to the gradual disappearance of her authentic self. Working with Irving Penn at Vogue demanded different sacrifices. Penn's controlled precision required Anne to convey complex emotions through the subtlest expressions, turning her face into a canvas that belonged more to art than to life. The collaboration produced elegant masterpieces, but each session required her to disappear a little deeper into the image. Penn's studio was a laboratory where every element was controlled and measured with scientific precision. Lighting was calculated to the degree, poses were refined through countless adjustments, and expressions were developed through repetition until they achieved a kind of perfection that seemed almost supernatural. The psychological demands of this work were enormous. Penn required Anne to access and project emotions that were often completely disconnected from her actual experiences or feelings, creating a split between her internal reality and external expression that became increasingly difficult to manage. But the results were undeniably magnificent. Penn's photographs of Anne achieved a level of artistic sophistication that elevated fashion photography to the status of fine art, creating images that museums would later acquire for their permanent collections. Then came Balenciaga, the great Spanish master who saw in Anne the perfect embodiment of his vision for the modern woman. Elegant, mysterious, untouchable. When she wore his designs, she transcended modeling and became living sculpture representing haute couture's highest aspirations. Cristobal Balenciaga was notoriously selective about the models who wore his designs, preferring to work with a small group of women who understood his aesthetic philosophy completely. His clothes required a particular kind of wearer, someone who could embody elegance without effort, sophistication without ostentation, perfection without humanity. Anne's collaboration with Balenciaga represented the pinnacle of her artistic achievement and the beginning of her psychological destruction. The designer's vision of feminine perfection was so complete and uncompromising that it required the absolute suppression of individual personality in service of aesthetic ideals. The famous 1953 photograph, Anne in black Balenciaga, arms at her sides, eyes staring directly into Avedon's lens with perfect detachment, became fashion's most influential image. But that coldness wasn't manufactured for artistic effect. It was the natural result of someone who had learned to protect herself by becoming unreachable. In Avedon's lens, she was perfect, but in the mirror she saw only a ghost. The image that emerged from that session was everything the fashion industry had been seeking. The perfect synthesis of haute couture and high art, a photograph that transcended commercial purpose and achieved the status of cultural icon. Anne's pose and expression captured something essential about the era's relationship with beauty, sophistication, and feminine mystique. But the creation of that image required Anne to access levels of emotional detachment that were psychologically dangerous. The coldness in her eyes wasn't acting. It was the natural result of someone who had learned to survive by removing herself from her own experiences. The industry celebrated her ubiquity. 7 Vogue covers in a single year, constant appearances in Harper's Bazaar, the undisputed face of American sophistication. But success meant working constantly, maintaining impossible physical standards, and existing primarily as an image rather than a person. The late 1950s represented the absolute peak of Anne's commercial and artistic success. Her face appeared on covers of every major fashion publication. Her image was associated with the most prestigious designers and photographers, and her influence on contemporary style was acknowledged throughout the industry. But the demands of maintaining this position were overwhelming. The schedule was relentless. Multiple shoots per week, constant travel between New York, Paris, and other fashion capitals, fittings and appointments that left little time for personal life or relationships. Her diary entries from this period reveal the psychological cost. Extreme dieting that left her perpetually exhausted, 12-hour shoots that blurred into endless repetition, and the growing realization that she had become a prisoner of her own perfection. The physical requirements of modeling had escalated to levels that would be recognized today as promoting eating disorders. But in the 1950s, the extreme measures required to maintain model-appropriate measurements were simply accepted as professional necessities. Anne's weight was monitored constantly. Her diet was restricted to levels that left her chronically fatigued, and her exercise regimen was designed to maintain measurements that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as she aged. The marriage to photographer Tom Palumbo in 1954 was presented as fashion's perfect union. 2 artists at their creative peak. But the reality was more complex and ultimately destructive. Palumbo's success depended on his access to Anne, and their collaboration became a trap that blurred every boundary between person and image. The relationship had begun as a professional collaboration that gradually evolved into personal involvement. But the transition was complicated by the power dynamics inherent in photographer-model relationships. Palumbo was talented and ambitious, but his career trajectory was increasingly dependent on his association with Anne's success. The marriage provided the fashion industry with a convenient narrative about Anne's personal life, the successful model who had found happiness with a fellow artist. But it also created new pressures and constraints. Palumbo's possessiveness about Anne's other professional relationships led to conflicts that affected her ability to maintain the collaborations that had built her career. More significantly, the marriage reinforced Anne's pattern of defining herself primarily in relation to other people's needs and visions. Just as she had learned to disappear into the roles required by photographers and designers, she now found herself disappearing into the identity of Tom Palumbo's wife, a role that was even more constraining than her professional obligations. "One day the camera will leave me, and I will have nothing," she confided to her diary during this period. The prophecy was more accurate than she realized. Fashion's appetite for new faces was insatiable, and even the most successful models had expiration dates that arrived with little warning. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The question becomes devastating when examining the contrast between Anne's public perfection and her private dissolution. While millions saw her as the embodiment of sophistication, her actual existence was increasingly artificial and constrained. Her apartment in Manhattan was expensively furnished and perfectly decorated, but it felt more like a stage set than a home. Every element had been chosen to support her professional image rather than to provide comfort or personal satisfaction. Even her private moments were influenced by the knowledge that photographers might want to capture her at home, requiring her to maintain aesthetic standards that left no room for genuine relaxation or authenticity. The social obligations that accompanied her success were equally artificial. Industry parties and cultural events required her to maintain her public persona even during supposedly private moments, creating a situation where Anne was never truly off duty from being Anne Saint Marie. The late 1950s brought subtle changes that would reshape fashion entirely. Younger models with different aesthetics reflected cultural values that prioritized youth over sophistication, spontaneity over control, accessibility over exclusivity. Twiggy's emergence in the early 1960s represented a complete transformation that left little room for Anne's particular perfection. The changes weren't immediately obvious, but industry insiders could sense a shift in cultural preferences that would ultimately marginalize the kind of sophisticated elegance that Anne represented. The new aesthetic emphasized youth and rebellion rather than refinement and tradition, creating opportunities for models who embodied energy and spontaneity rather than controlled perfection. Anne was still capable of producing extraordinary work, but the industry's attention was increasingly focused elsewhere. Magazine editors began booking her for fewer high-profile assignments. Photographers started developing new muses, and designers began to associate their brands with younger, more contemporary faces. The moment of truth came during a 1962 Vogue session. Anne stood before Avedon's camera as she had hundreds of times before, but something had changed. The magic that had made their collaboration extraordinary was gone. Not because of any failing in her technique, but because she was no longer willing to disappear completely into someone else's vision. The session had been scheduled to shoot Dior's latest collection, and on the surface, everything proceeded normally. Anne arrived prepared. The clothes were beautiful, the lighting was perfect. But from the first shot, Avedon could sense that something fundamental had shifted. Where their previous collaborations had been characterized by an almost telepathic understanding, this session felt forced and artificial. Anne's poses were technically perfect, but they lacked the emotional resonance that had made their work transcendent. Her expressions were beautiful but empty, like perfectly executed drawings that had been drained of life. "I can't find her anymore," Avedon whispered to his assistant, studying the Polaroids between shots. "She's still beautiful, but Anne isn't there." He was right. After years of perfecting the art of erasure, Anne had become so skilled at disappearing that she could no longer locate herself in the images. The ghost had finally consumed its creator. The realization was devastating for both artist and muse. Avedon understood that their collaboration, which had produced some of the most influential fashion photographs of the era, had reached its natural conclusion. Anne understood that her career, which had been built on her ability to embody other people's visions, was over. Did this tragic realization mark her downfall? Or was it simply the inevitable conclusion of a career built on systematic self-erasure? The retirement that followed wasn't dramatic but quiet, a gentle dissolving that left the fashion world suddenly bereft of its most perfect reflection. The announcement was handled through Eileen Ford's office with characteristic professionalism and minimal fanfare. Anne St. Marie was retiring from modeling to focus on her personal life and marriage. The industry press covered the story briefly, treating it as a natural career transition rather than the psychological crisis it actually represented. But for those who had worked closely with Anne, the retirement was both shocking and inevitable. The woman who had defined elegance for an entire generation was walking away at the height of her influence, leaving behind a legacy that would shape fashion photography for decades to come. She vanished, but her image remained. The transition to Connecticut was both exile and salvation. The small house in an affluent but quiet town represented Anne's attempt to discover who she might be when no cameras were watching. But the process proved more difficult than anticipated. After years of existing primarily as other people's visions, the basic questions of identity, what did she enjoy, prefer, desire, had become impossible to answer. The house itself was modest by the standards of her previous Manhattan lifestyle, but it offered something that her professional success had never provided: privacy. For the first time in over a decade, Anne could move through her daily life without considering how her appearance or behavior might affect her professional image. But the freedom was also terrifying. After years of having every moment scheduled and every decision made for her by professional obligations, the autonomy of private life felt overwhelming rather than liberating. Simple choices, what to wear, how to spend her time, what to eat, had become foreign concepts that required conscious effort to navigate. The garden became her salvation. Roses required patience rather than perfection, seasonal rhythms rather than artificial urgency. For the first time in decades, Anne was creating beauty that was entirely her own, free from cameras and couture and the insatiable demands of an industry that consumed youth. The work was physical and demanding in ways that were completely different from modeling. Where photography had required her to maintain perfect stillness and control, gardening demanded movement, flexibility, and acceptance of imperfection. Plants grew according to their own rhythms rather than human schedules, and success was measured in seasons rather than magazine issues. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Anne, the darkness wasn't scandal or failure, but the gradual realization that her greatest professional achievement, becoming fashion's perfect image, had required the complete sacrifice of her authentic self. The process of rediscovering her identity was complicated by the fact that she had no clear memory of who she had been before becoming Anne St. Marie. The transformation from Marianne LeBlanc had been so complete that returning to her earlier self was no longer possible. That girl had been erased as thoroughly as any unflattering photograph. The divorce from Palumbo in 1965 was handled quietly, without media attention. The fashion industry had moved on to new faces, and Anne's personal life was no longer newsworthy. The privacy she had craved was finally available, but it came at the cost of complete professional irrelevance. The end of the marriage was both relief and additional loss. While the relationship had become constraining and ultimately destructive, it had also provided structure and purpose during the difficult transition to private life. Without Palumbo's professional connections and social obligations, Anne found herself even more isolated from the world she had once dominated. Her correspondence with Avedon during these years reveals a friendship that transcended their collaboration. But even these letters were tinged with melancholy. Both understood that their most creative period was behind them, and both struggled with the knowledge that their artistic partnership had required sacrifices that were difficult to justify in retrospect. She gave more to fashion than fashion ever gave back, he would later write. We kept asking for more until there wasn't anything left of the person underneath. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? Anne's withdrawal from public life was motivated by the need to protect what remained of her authentic self rather than by defeat. The 1970s and 1980s brought Anne's gradual adaptation to existence outside the fashion industry. She developed interests that had nothing to do with her former career: classical music, painting, literature. But the process of rebuilding identity after years of professional self-effacement proved challenging and sometimes overwhelming. The physical changes that came with aging were particularly difficult for someone whose career had been built entirely on appearance. Anne watched her reflection change in ways that would have been unremarkable for most women, but felt devastating to someone who had been celebrated for visual perfection. Her few close friendships were with people who had no connection to fashion and who valued her for qualities unrelated to her former career. These relationships provided emotional connections she had been unable to maintain during her modeling years, though they also highlighted how much of her adult life had been spent in professional rather than personal contexts. Connecticut, 1995. The garden is in perfect bloom when Anne St. Marie makes her final appearance in print, not as a model but as the subject of a small obituary in the local newspaper. The notice mentions her former career briefly, focusing instead on her decades-long dedication to roses and quiet contributions to local charities. The fashion industry's response is swift but shallow. Vogue runs a retrospective celebrating her as the face that defined an era. But the article focuses almost exclusively on photographs rather than the person. The images that made her famous are reproduced once again, each one a testament to professional success and a reminder of personal costs. The funeral is small and private, attended by local friends who had known Anne in retirement rather than colleagues from her professional past. The woman who had once been photographed by the century's greatest artists is buried without fanfare. Her grave marked by a simple stone that mentions neither her former career nor her professional achievements. The roses continue to bloom each spring, tended now by a local service but still reflecting the care and attention she had devoted to them for decades. The garden serves as a more authentic memorial to Anne's later life than any fashion photograph, preserving her image in museum collections. She vanished, but her image remained. The irony of Anne's legacy is both beautiful and tragic. Photographs that continue to define elegance and sophistication while the woman who created them remains largely unknown and unknowable. Contemporary fashion magazines still reference her work in retrospective features, and young models are compared to her as the standard for editorial sophistication. But these same publications celebrate her as an aesthetic object while ignoring her experience as a human being, perpetuating the same patterns that had made her career both successful and destructive. In the end, the rose garden gave her back a reflection the camera never could: the possibility of existing as herself rather than as someone else's perfect dream. The roses bloom and fade according to natural rhythms rather than artificial demands, creating beauty that belongs to its creator rather than consuming her in its creation. Anne St. Marie became fashion's most perfect ghost by learning to disappear so completely that even she forgot where she had gone. But perhaps her roses were the only photographs she ever truly owned, beauty that was hers alone, free from cameras and couture and the endless hunger of an industry that feeds on the dreams of young women. Do we celebrate her beauty, or mourn the woman we never saw? The question lingers like light through Connecticut trees, illuminating a garden where fashion's greatest ghost finally learned to cast her own shadow.